This is the penultimate video in my series on the early years of the legions. And so the Lunar Wolves, a legion that should have gone down as one of the greatest in the history of the Imperium. But of course, their legacy would be ruined by turning traitor in the Horus heresy. Now, the early legion were recruited from gang members, it's believed from an area known as the Jutigran Bowl and the Sabsation subplate slum. So these were people that were living on the edge of society that lived a very brutal and harsh life. This is quite common amongst Space Marine recruits. This is because this kind of conditions create very hard people, very physically tough, mentally tough people that can get through the recruitment and implantation phase of becoming an Astarte, which is incredibly brutal, incredibly hard, and almost everyone dies during it. So it needs these extreme people, these people that have lived incredibly difficult lives, to have at least some chance of passing through this phase. So in this sense, the recruits for the Lunar Wolves were no different than most of the other legions. However, they did have some differences in their character. They were proud, obviously. They were considered humorless and lacking in empathy. That's, again, not unusual amongst recruits. They also had no sense of mysticism or ritual amongst their culture, so they weren't prone to those, which is different from some of the other legions who did recruit from societies that had already had these more deeper traditions that could potentially lead the legion in a particular direction or a particular propensity for practices that went against imperial truth. They were, of course, extremely aggressive. However, unlike some of the legions who were renowned for their aggression, the early recruits for the Lunar Wolves were also known for their very strong self-control, which held this aggression in check. So the early legion favoured shock assaults and the use of overwhelming force. So they would appear out of nowhere and smash an enemy ruthlessly and then disappear again. They were extremely direct in the way that they fought. They would favour the use of gunships to deliver their troops into battle. They didn't use a huge amount of armour or artillery and instead preferred to move rapidly. But unlike some of the other more rapid moving legions like the White Scars or the Raven Guard, their attacks were not rapid hit and run type attacks. They were overwhelming, and once they started, they continued until victory. They became renowned for starting and finishing campaigns. In fact, it seems like the Emperor preferred to use them in this way, to either appear out of nowhere and destroy an enemy that didn't even know it was going to be attacked, or to deliver the final attack in a major campaign where they would be the force that delivered the final defeat to an enemy. Often their attacks were so overwhelming that the first attack was the last attack. You sent them in, they defeated the enemy, and that was it. It was done. In many ways, they combined the best attributes of the rapid-moving legions and the close assault specialist legions into one. They were extremely aggressive and brutal, but they were able to control themselves and not lose control, not go too far and begin wiping out civilian populations. But where they needed to, they would kill people as collateral damage, but they were focused on a conquest. They were the ultimate conquerors in that sense. Once given a target, they would launch an overwhelming assault on that enemy, obliterate them, and then move on quickly. They weren't going to hang around to build bases and expand the Imperium in that way, like the Imperial Fist, for example, would do. In their case, they were just looking for the next enemy to go on and defeat. But you could trust them to carry out that attack with professionalism and not to lose control and need to be reined back in, like, for example, the Space Wolves, the Blood Angels, or the World Eaters. So they quickly gained a reputation of being one of the most effective of the legions. Now, in the beginning, they were simply known as the 16th Legion, but very quickly they started to be known as the Emperor's Wolves. They picked up this name of being the Emperor's Wolves, the Emperor releasing his wolves on an enemy, and this was because of they epitomized the controlled savagery that the wolf represented to the old Terran societies. Now, they took part in the conquest of Luna, which was one of the biggest and most important campaigns of the end of the Unification Wars, because it kind of linked the end of the Unification Wars with the beginning of the Great Crusade. You can look at it as the first battle of the Great Crusade, as the Emperor sends his forces out to conquer the solar system. And because they were so instrumental in the conquest of Luna, and the battle for Luna was so important to the future of the Imperium, they were given the title the Lunar Wolves, or at least they seem to have embraced the title at this time. And it then became their official name from then on, until eventually, of course, they would become the Sons of Horus, but that's in the far, far future. And so, because they had now embraced this title, they started to embrace the symbology of the wolf. They started to use the image of the wolf as part of their livery. They started to wear wolf heads as signs of rank and so on. And so they became intrinsically linked with the symbology of wolves, long before the Space Wolves themselves would take on that kind of iconography. They were the first wolves of the Emperor, and they were the first legion strongly associated with the wolf image. And indeed, the Space Wolves themselves were one of the later legions to become militarily active during the Great Crusade. And so they weren't really a thing when the Lunar Wolves were becoming famous and taking on this image of the wolf. And so there wasn't really two legions competing for being the wolves of the Emperor. There were simply the Lunar Wolves. And later, the Space Wolves would come onto the scene, and they themselves wouldn't really pick up the imagery of the wolf until they were reunited with their Primarch, Leman Russ, on Fenris, where the wolf was intrinsic to that culture. And so, of course, eventually the Space Wolves would emerge onto the battlefields of the Great Crusade, but they would never come close to eclipsing the Lunar Wolves. The Lunar Wolves were always one of the primary legions of the Imperium before the heresy. They were more famous, more capable, bigger, and simply admired much more. The Space Wolves were always on the edge of the Imperial forces. They were relatively small. They were not particularly trusted. They were not that effective because they were so uncontrollable, and they were always on the edge of being censored for being too out of control. They were always under suspicion for signs of indiscipline because they were so incapable of controlling themselves. The Lunar Wolves are completely different to that. So there is no direct comparison between the two legions of this early period. And that's even before Horus would take over the Lunar Wolves. Of course, he would take over very soon because he was the first Primarch found. Of course, that would elevate them to a whole new level of prestige and of capability, and would keep them there until the time of the heresy itself. And so, uniquely amongst the legions, the Lunar Wolves found their Primarch very early, and so early that they had almost no time to form a legion culture without their Primarch in charge, and almost no time to develop this very strong Terran culture before recruits from their new homeworld, which would be Cthonia, would start to influence the legion. So Cthonia was so close to Terra that contact had been maintained even through the worst of the warp storms. And very little contact, but there was contact. It was far enough away that it would take many years to get there and back, but you wouldn't need to use the warp to do it. And so, because it was rich in minerals, contact had been maintained to essentially draw out the resources from the world. And it had been mined so much over the past thousands of years that it was essentially devoid of any resources. And the population had descended into barbarianism. So gangs of Mad Max-style techno-barbarians running around killing each other, which was not too dissimilar to the world that Terra had become, although Terra had maintained higher levels of technology and higher population centres, so large hive cities. However, the recruits of the early Lunar Wolves had come from societies that were very similar to these gangs on Cthonia. And so there was quite a strong overlap between the way that they thought, the way they fought, etc. So, and of course, what was also on Cthonia was Horus. Now, the early history of Horus is very, very patchy and unreliable and full of contradictions. It's similar to Alpharis's history in that sense. Very hard to tell where he was found, how old he was, what he had done, or anything like that. What is generally believed to be the most likely events are that he was deposited on Cthonia by the forces of chaos, when they distributed the pods of Primarchs. But because it was so close to Earth, the Emperor found him very young, and he hadn't actually been influenced much by the planet, by the culture of the planet, and that he grew up essentially beside the Emperor. So he was found still as a child, whereas the other Primarchs were all adults by the time they were found. So he hadn't had a chance to really develop as a person, and he also hadn't had a chance to become the kind of conqueror, the leader of a planet, which most of the other Primarchs did, simply because they were there long enough to do that. He wasn't there long enough to do that, but he did seem to be interacting with these gangs and take on at least some of their knowledge and practices. Now, whether he was found as a child on Cthonia by the Emperor, or whether he made his own way back to Terra as a child and was brought up on Terra by the Emperor, or whether he was found slightly later, which is some accounts seem to say, but that was probably less likely, and that he was more adult. That was probably the least likely. But he was reunited with the Emperor very early. He was mentored by the Emperor personally and spent a huge amount of time with him, and of course grew up to be his most trusted and closest son. And the influence this has on the Legion, the Lunar Wolves, is of course they get their Primarch very early. And so before the Great Crusaders even left the solar system, Horus is able to take command of the Legion. And around the same time, the Imperium is able to start recruiting from Cthonia. So large numbers of Chthonians are brought to Terra to become part of the legions. It may even be the case that so many were brought that they were used in the other legions as well in the very early days of creating the legions. Although the majority would go on to become Lunar Wolves, it's quite likely that Chthonian recruits ended up in many of the other legions because they were just useful. They were very good gene stock, and there were a lot of them. The Imperium needed people to use as these early recruits. And you've got to remember, in the early stages of the legions, the recruitment process was more haphazard. It was more prone to error. There was more people dying. A lot more people died during the implementation process as rejections, etc. happened. And so they wanted to use this resource that they had of this other world, which had useful human candidates that they didn't really care that much about, and could just pump them into the process and see who came out the other end. Yeah, that's the way that the Imperium tends to operate. And so eventually, of course, they stabilize the processes enough so that at least a few less people died during the implantation process than they used to. Now, with the Lunar Wolves particularly, they began to recruit heavily from Cthonia, and of course it would become their official homeworld. The culture of Cthonia would begin to influence the Legion. And because, as we've said, it was so early on in the Legion, there wasn't a hugely strong Terran culture for them to replace anyway. And there was this overlap already of the type of people that were being recruited and this kind of gang cultures. So they kind of merged pretty seamlessly. And very quickly, the Legion took on all of the traditions of these Chthonian gangs, their symbology, their ranking systems and things like this. And the ways of the Terran Legion were very quickly diluted. However, they did keep this very strong desire for quick, rapid assaults that would appear out of nowhere and then would be relentlessly pursued to victory, which is something that Horus himself really liked, and it's probably the reason the Legion fought this way is due to his influence of his gene seed. And this fitted very well with the Chthonian gangers as well and the way they like to fight. This was a happy union of styles, and the Legion would carry on growing and gaining victory after victory using this style that had first been implemented by these Terran recruits and carried on by the Chthonian recruits and Horus's leadership. And of course, under Horus, being that he was so favoured by the Emperor as the first Primarch to be found and personally mentored by the Emperor, the Legion grew in more and more in prestige, more and more in reputation. People wanted to fight with them. People were looking to be assigned to Horus's fleet, to be part of his forces. He had developed a great reputation very rapidly as a great commander, a great leader, very tactically and strategically astute, someone who was a military genius beyond anyone else in the Imperium other than the Emperor at this time, because there were no other Primarchs to even rival him. Now, later other Primarchs would come in, but they were always in a subordinate position. But in this early stage, they weren't even around. So it was just the Emperor or him. If you were a military man, a fighting man, you wanted to be part of Horus's fleet. And he was very good at using other people's resources well. He would always spot the strengths and weaknesses in a force and use it in a way that got the best out of them. And this made him even more popular. In many of my other videos where I've talked about the early years of other legions, I often end up mentioning Horus because he's often quite influential in the early years of these other legions, like the White Scars or the Raven Guard. And he was very popular amongst these other legions because he recognized those strengths that other people didn't see. Other people passed them over, ignored them, etc. He embraced them and he used them for things that they were good at and gave them a sense of worth and fulfillment in what they were doing. But he also did it in a way that accumulated power around him. And this is a long time before the heresy even is a possibility. This is not something he's doing to prepare for the heresy. He's doing it because that's just his nature. He wants to create this ultimate military force, this complementary force of all of the units that he could get from the wider imperial forces and place them together and use them in the right way. But at the core of all this are the Lunar Wolves. They are the main force. They're the main military force of Horus, and the other forces that he acquires and aids, helps grow and develop are really periphery. They complement the Lunar Wolves as the main strike force, and they help them achieve their victories, but they don't exceed them. They don't grow equally with the Lunar Wolves. The Lunar Wolves grow more and more powerful, bigger, stronger, more prestigious, and the other units orbit around them in a sense. And so there we are. That's the Lunar Wolves. The early history of the Lunar Wolves obviously is quite short because Horus is found so early, and it is very intrinsically linked with the finding of Horus and being reunited with the Empress so early. So of course that changes their story. It would be interesting to see what they would have turned out to be had Horus not been found for like 50 years or 100 years like many of the other Primarchs, and they could have had their own story, developing their own culture, free from the influence of their Primarch and the planet of their Primarch. Would it be interesting to see what they turned out like? But it does seem like that at their core, they were always going to be very effective, violent, aggressive, but controlled, and always wanting to use whatever techniques were necessary to achieve victory. So they would have remained relatively balanced, and I think not got out of control, not become too specialized, unlike some of the other legions who really struggled without their Primarchs. So tell me what you think about the Lunar Wolves. Do you admire them? What do you think they would have turned out to be like had Horus not been found so early? What would you think they'd be like with another Primarch having been found first and becoming the Emperor's chosen number one? So without that extra prestige that gets attached to them because of Horus leading them. So I'd be very interested to hear from you in the comments. Otherwise, like, subscribe and share, and I will see you next time.